Okay, well, thanks for joining me. My name's Dr. Wuerz, and I'm an infectious disease specialist at St. Boniface Hospital. Just wanted to give a bit of background on the vaccination side of things for COVID-19, just to give a bit of perspective. And I start with this slide. This is a slide from 1900, and it's one of my favorite slides because it's so poignant. This photo was taken in the house of Dr. Edward Jenner, who is considered the father of vaccination. And he was instrumental in inventing a vaccination against smallpox, which was a very deadly infectious disease that's now eradicated. Here you can see two boys, same age, actually they're brothers, one of whom was inoculated or vaccinated against smallpox, the other wasn't. And it's just a striking image. And of course, now smallpox has been eradicated due to vaccination. So a real success story on that front. Now we're dealing with a whole new virus, COVID-19, and it is a virus that can cause severe manifestations, but I think there's some misunderstanding about how it might look and the range of how it might look in different people. So it really has a range of clinical presentations, and those can stretch from having no symptoms, but with a positive COVID-19 test indicating viral transmission, or sorry, the presence of the virus. And that's a state where it may still be able to transmit the virus to another person. On the other hand, people may have mild or moderate symptoms. Probably the most common manifestation in especially in younger individuals, without breathing problems or having low oxygen levels, and they would get something that kind of looks like the flu. You might feel like it was just a bad case of the flu. And then there's the more severe end of things, and that includes dangerously low oxygen levels. They may be able to catch their breath. They would really require admission to hospital to stabilize those oxygen levels, and it does carry a significant risk of disease progression and death. And then at the very severe end of things would be the critical symptoms, which requires even more intensive respiratory and circulatory support in a place like a critical care unit or ICU, with a very high risk for progression to disease progression and death. And so the thing about COVID-19 is that we can stratify the risk based on age and other risk factors, but the simple truth is that we don't really understand in one person versus another, why does someone get asymptomatic or mild moderate disease and another person with the same risk factors end up in the hospital in the intensive care unit or even dead? It has a lot to do with how the virus interacts with the immune system, but as far as fully understanding in one person versus another, we're not there yet. And so you can see here, this is actually what we call seroprevalence data. So it uses an antibody test to determine who has been exposed to the virus. And so it's including those people who might have been asymptomatic, not just the ones that got a COVID-19 test. And you can see here that the risk of having hospitalization, intensive care unit care, or death goes up over time with age. It's even higher for older individuals, but here's sort of the younger groups. And this data was all taken before the variants of concern came up into general circulation. And those have been estimated to increase the severity by about 55%. So that's sort of added on to the risks that you see there. So the risk is quite variable. And then nevertheless, there is a substantial risk, on the order of 2% for the variants of concern, even in that low 20 to 29 age group, for being hospitalized, and a not terribly low risk of requiring intensive care unit care and death even in that group, although certainly the risk does go up with age and with other medical comorbidities too. So and when it comes to the vaccines, we have 3 different types in Manitoba. 2 of them are what's called mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. They work by bringing the body immune cells, the T and B cells in the immune system, a sort of blueprint, which is the mRNA, for making just a small part of the virus, the spike protein part. And it just so happens that that spike protein part is a part of the virus that, if it is targeted specifically by the body's immune system, the body's immune system is able to essentially neutralize that virus extraordinarily efficiently. And so an effective immune response is learned by the body's immune system within 14 days, and it's boosted by a second dose later on. There's another vaccine called Astra-Zeneca, which is a different mechanism. It uses a inactivated virus, a harmless virus called adenovirus, to deliver that same spike protein to the immune cells and trigger the effective immune response that I mentioned. How do they work? It's quite clever. The vaccination will deliver the spike protein to those B cells, which produce antibodies and attack a virus directly, and also to the T cells, which are super important for protection against a virus. And it delivers that spike protein so that they can be trained to recognize it and to defend very effectively against it. But it takes time, 14 days, and even the immune system learns over time. So 14 days, and it's even learning after that. So how well do they work? They work really well. So the initial randomized studies included tens of thousands of individuals with these vaccinations, and they compared them in a randomized fashion to a dose of placebo and just a saline injection. And so those studies found that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, the mRNA vaccines, had a 95% effectiveness against all symptomatic infections. So that's mostly those mild to moderate cases. AstraZeneca had about a 70% effectiveness. But when it came to severe disease like hospitalization or death, all of those vaccines had, a 95 to 100% rate of effectiveness. So they were very, very good at preventing severe disease or death. And just to put it in context, I mean, we have vaccines against the flu, and the vaccines that we have against the flu are not nearly this good. Their effectiveness is in the range of 50 to 70% in the best case. And the prevention of viral transmission from person to person is also prevented by these vaccines. Now, this is a bit of information that I don't think was well communicated initially. The initial randomized trials did not study this. The science wasn't in. And so what people heard everyone saying, or scientists saying, was that the vaccines don't prevent transmission. That's not true. We just didn't have the science in. But everyone expected that they would protect against transmission, and indeed that has been confirmed in numerous large real-world studies, and they've shown that viral transmission is reduced. Not sure exactly how much, but possibly by up to 80 to 90%, which is phenomenal. Vaccine side effects can be quite common. You probably heard a lot about this. And really, one way of thinking about this, which I think is a good way, is that it's just telling you that your immune system is alive and well. It's bear witness to me. Symptoms usually last up to 24 hours. Pain and redness at the injection site. Some other symptoms: tiredness, fevers. Rarely, a severe allergic reaction called anaphylaxis can occur. About 5 to 10 cases per million people have been documented, and that's about in the range of other vaccines as well. It's a known and it's a known side effect from vaccines. There's a new rare and serious side effect called vaccine-induced thrombosis, which is a blood clot. And this is a probable association that's limited to the Astra-Zeneca vaccine, also the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which we don't have here. It's serious, it's rare. There's maybe a 1 in 50 to a 1 in 100,000 people vaccinated who will develop this. And it can happen 4 to 30 days after the vaccination. And so just to put that in context, this is some data that was put out by the University of Cambridge. And you can see here, based on a coronavirus incidence of 2 per 10,000 people, which is actually lower than what we are seeing here now in Manitoba currently. You can see the potential benefits from the AstraZeneca vaccine are far outweighed by the potential harms, including the vaccine-induced thrombosis. Actually, vaccine-induced thrombosis seems to be more common in younger individuals compared to those older, whereas the risks and also therefore the benefits are higher from the vaccine in older individuals. So you can see those sort of stacked up against each other there. Nevertheless, Health Canada and the Canadian public health authorities are all moving towards using the mRNA vaccines as opposed to AstraZeneca, just because we have more supply of those anyway, and those mRNA vaccines are not associated with this thrombosis, this blood clot risk. So just to come back to Edward Jenner, then the father of vaccines, he said that the highest powers in our nature are a sense of moral excellence, the principle of reason and reflection, benevolence to our creatures, and our love of the divine being. And I think that is really what vaccines are bringing us in a sense. And what better way to protect ourselves, protect our family and our communities. And that's it.
Carrie, can you speak to how vaccines are developed? I'm thinking specific, not necessarily the science behind it. Maybe if you wanted to get into that, but for at least for those that only have a high school level understanding of science. But also, I guess where I'm coming from is the time frame in developing the COVID vaccines in relation to the vaccine for yearly influenza, and some of the concerns that these vaccines were rushed.
Yes.
And for that reason, we can't trust them.
Yes. Yeah, that's a really common concern that I hear. So it's true that this was absolutely the fastest vaccine development that we have, ever seen in the history of humankind. And so these vaccines were developed and ready for distribution, manufacturing, distribution, approved within close to a year of initiation. And so that is way faster than the next fastest vaccine that has been developed was 4.5 years for the mumps vaccine. And so, so that raises some questions. I think also, some of the buzzwords and messaging around it have lended themselves to, this concern that, were these vaccines rushed? Operation Warp Speed, I think, didn't do anything, do anybody any favors along those lines. Is Warp Speed rushed, those kinds of things. So, but just to put it in context, I guess a couple of things. The first thing is, is that, these vaccines used some technology that has been, the technology that they used enabled them to be developed very quickly. Okay, so within weeks of this virus being isolated, even I think within days of it being isolated and the full genetic code being known, back in January, early January of 2020, it was shared, but internationally, it was public domain. So the vaccine researchers had a very early understanding of the genetic makeup to be able to select the right targets for vaccination. And then they benefited from several other things. One is that many of them were mRNA vaccines, which are relatively easier to scale up quickly from a scientific perspective. They're just a lot easier. You can, if you know what vaccine target you'd like to introduce to the immune system, so to teach those B and T cells, then you can insert that genetic code into the mRNA that you've already got developed and tested. And it's a lot quicker than going about it the old way, which was basically test this, test that, see what works. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is that was the science rushed? No, I don't think it was rushed. The vaccine companies benefited from many things. One is that they had a lot of money that was provided for them by the US government primarily, but by other international and national organizations. So a lot of vaccine and drug development, a lot of the holdup comes from economics. If you have a potential product that you'd like to bring, from inception all the way through, you've got, a potential therapeutic product. First, you need to start with doing some testing on, a very few number of people, what we call phase 1 studies. And then if that is successful, you need to go back to the regulators. You need to also go back to your shareholders and say, like, look, here we got a product. We're going to move forward. Can you invest some more money in the phase 2 studies? Okay. And, if that is successful, then you would go back to the shareholders and say, yes, we need to do a bigger study. It's going to cost a lot more money, but it's worth it. Here's our results. And then eventually, if there's enough investment and economic incentive, then they would move forward with these phase 3 studies. Each time the studies are getting bigger and bigger and testing more people, they're getting costlier and costlier. So these companies were bankrolled by the US government, by many organizations. They did not need to go through that process. They had that economic backstop. Even if they failed, they knew they were going to be okay. So yes, that was a huge benefit to them. In addition to that, some of the phases of the studies were actually done concurrently. So, even though you haven't quite finished phase 1, you see some of the preliminary results, you're able to move forward with phase 2 and phase 3. In addition to that, the mRNA technology had already been tested extensively on, like many different infectious agents in phase 1 studies, as well as in cancer. It's actually being tested against cancer cells even before coronavirus rolled around. So it was a known technology, although not yet approved in any other vaccine. But it was there, it was tested, and it was extraordinarily quick for the development. So I think all of those things really helped. In addition to that, you had the availability of volunteers really quickly, right? They were able to advertise through social media, get the word out, get tons of volunteers for these studies in a very short amount of time. And so all of those things, really stacked in favor of moving quickly. It does not mean that the science was shortcutted. These vaccines were still tested in tens of thousands of individuals before they got to the stage where the regulators like Health Canada, the FDA in the United States, and so forth were able to look at all that data and say, like, here's the safety and effectiveness data. And so the science was all there. The science was not shortcutted, but the it was facilitated a lot more than the science had been in the past. And as someone who does some research, I can tell you that normally there are a million different things, red tape and other things that really stand in your way to moving quickly, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes it is kind of an impediment, actually. So those things were moved along a lot quicker than normally. Yes. So, at the end of the day, do I think the vaccines were rushed? I mean, in a sense, they were facilitated, and they had a lot of political backing to, remove some of that red tape. They had a lot of other things moving in their favor, essentially unlimited resources to direct towards that. So many researchers that got their normal program of research uh totally, they were pulled and they were put on COVID, right? So I think actually this is a remarkable story. It's like, here's humanity pulling together and developing an emergency, very complex product that in the end is a remarkable one, safe, effective, and getting us through this pandemic.
Tim, you unmuted for a moment. Did you have something to add?
Not anything pressing.
Oh, sure.
A question that I hear, and maybe you guys are intending to ask it, a question that I keep hearing is, these vaccines have genetic material. I'm afraid of them modifying genetic material. I have a simple answer to that, but maybe Terry has a better answer.
Go for it, Tim.
mRNA doesn't last very long. It breaks down very quickly once it enters the body. It enters cells that prepare the protein that it's designed to code for, and then the mRNA falls apart. It's gone. It doesn't alter a person's DNA. I think it's
that's right.
I think it's a fair question for someone to ask who doesn't have a science background. The answer is that mRNA vaccines are not a scary technology at all. They're brilliant technology.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess, a picture is probably worth 1,000 words here, but the mRNA is like the blueprint to make all the things that the cell needs to survive, but it is not a part of that DNA that's passed down from cell to cell. Okay. So, it's kind of like bringing the instructions to IKEA furniture into your house. It's gonna help you build those desks or whatever you bought at IKEA. It's not gonna actually change your house. So yes, no, it will not affect the DNA of the cell, and that's the DNA that's passed down from cell to cell. And then once the mRNA has done its job, to present that spike protein to the B and T cells and train the body's immune system really efficiently to go after the spike protein in the virus, it's gone. It's not lasting an extended period of time in the body.
Another question for you. Where would you recommend, or where do you even send people for the source of information? Because there's all kinds of stories, and then there's all kinds of reports. And I heard one even earlier today, right? Someone was talking about issues that could be linked to, let's say, fertility issues or those kinds of things, right?
Yes.
And they can come across or present as really looks like an okay source, and so then it brings up all kinds of questions. Where would you guide or usher people that to say, hey, this is a trusted source? And yeah, maybe you can help there.
That's a great question. I wish I had a really easy answer to that. I mean, I think that a few trusted sources would be places like, definitely certain universities have put out a lot of really good information, and so if these are attached to respected universities, and I'm thinking about, Johns Hopkins has a wealth of information on vaccines. Similarly, Oxford and Cambridge in the UK have really good information that they've put out. I'm not saying that other places don't have that, but it can be really tricky to sort those things out. So yeah, in addition to that, like even just the regular sort of like public health websites can give some good information on vaccines, I think. So the CDC in the United States, Public Health Agency of Canada has put out good guidelines. Yeah. But yeah, I think that there's so much information out there on the internet, and sometimes bad information can masquerade as good science, and so it can be challenging even for scientists and like myself. Like we sort of can pick up on some things that that are kind of red flags, but if you, as you say, if you don't have necessarily a science background, that's going to be really challenging. So yeah, so I don't know, I would trust the university sites, the public health sites as a primary source.
Despite the political issues in North America, the scientific information provided by the CDC has been pretty good.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely good
information. Information from the government of Manitoba sites has also been good. They're not providing bad information. What gets very hard for people is when they try to read original research, or what we call primary literature. I have a master's degree in organic chemistry. It took me 7 years to get there, or 6 years to get there. And then I did 4 years of medical school, and then I did 5 years of residency training. I'm not qualified to read some of that primary literature after like 17 years of post-secondary education. Terry went into a field that's closely related. He can evaluate some of that primary literature.
Oh, some of it's out of my depths, like we're bringing in information from the fields of particle physics and aerodynamics when it comes to transmission, and that's way out of my field. And so but I think too is that looking at one study in isolation is sometimes a bit of a problem, because rarely in sort of in science and in medicine do we have like just a single study in isolation that gives us the end all and be all. It's really the aggregate and the building upon what we already know that's a really important context. So yeah, so primary literature can be a challenge for sure. And yeah, what we generally, the worst thing that we can do is start already with our biases and then go looking for data to support that, right? So we all have biases, right? Like I already said in my presentation, my bias is that vaccines have saved countless lives in human history and eradicated diseases. And so yeah, I have a bias towards saying, like, if a vaccine is effective and safe, like, I'm inclined to trust it, of course, pending all of the regulatory work that needs to be done. But other people have other biases, and we just have to recognize those too, because I do see that, like people have some kind of bias, and then they go looking for that data to support their claim, I guess.
Another question I've heard from those that I guess I'll label as vaccine hesitant, is the concern that we don't know about side effects a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now.
Yes.
So not that I expect you to predict the future in any real way, but just given
Yes.
what we already know, what you already know about other mRNA technologies, can we
Yes.
make good guesses as to long-term side effects, if any?
Yes, yes, that's a good question. And of course, we don't have 5-10 year follow-up data from these vaccines. So that's absolutely true. But nevertheless, it's something that most of us who are familiar with these vaccines are not very concerned about. And the reason is, well, two things. Number one, vaccines in general, the side effects that do occur tend to occur in a relatively circumscribed period of time. Okay, so in most cases it's within days. In some rare cases it can be within a few months. And so in terms of side effects that occur years later from any vaccine that we know about, it just doesn't happen. And we have so much experience with other vaccines unrelated to COVID-19 that this is just not a concern. Now, when it comes to mRNA vaccines, which are the new kid on the block, first of all, they're not entirely new. There have been phase 1 studies that have looked at other types of infections, and they haven't had any major safety signals. Those are small studies, so you have to take that with a grain of salt. There certainly hasn't been, hundreds of thousands of people that have been vaccinated. So, but again, these products are extremely short-lived in the body. They do not incorporate into DNA. There's just no expectation that we're going to be having these kinds of long-term side effects. So, I mean, I don't know, how much comfort people can take from that. I take a lot. I don't think, I mean, sort of that that my concern would be, this really theoretical possibility, especially where the data so far haven't been showing any safety concerns. And then, of course, you got to stack that up because everything has risk. You say, like, well, what about the risk of COVID-19? And right now, that's a real and present danger. So, I think that there's been a lot of controversies related to this pandemic. I've been tracking them. And, one of the things I would say is that even among infectious diseases doctors, there's not 100% agreement on some of the things that, that we might talk about, the extent of lockdowns, how much do children contribute to the transmission of the virus, how effective are masks exactly, how exactly is the virus transmitted? All of these things, there's been some dissent and controversy and conversation. One of the things that other infectious disease doctors in Canada can agree on 100% is that these vaccines are effective, they're safe, we don't expect long-term side effects, and they're strongly recommended by all of these individuals who I know for themselves and all of their family members.
Yeah. Just to add a little bit, maybe a little bit less scientific of a spin. I don't know a single doctor who hasn't received vaccination. And my understanding is that somewhere around 95% or more of healthcare providers in hospitals have received the vaccine, one of the vaccines. So if that tells you something about where we view it, that we're willing to put it into our own bodies, I think that says something. The second, regards to the long-term risks, from a mechanistic perspective, the risk of these vaccines should happen while the body is responding to the vaccine, which is in that first 2 weeks, first month period of time. After that period of time, none of the vaccine's left in your body, it's all gone. Actually, it's been gone for some time by then. So if there hasn't been something that's happened by then, it would be hard for us to understand how anything could happen from one of these vaccines. I think it's worth noting that we talk about how many people die of COVID, and that's That's a big deal. We just crossed 1,000 victims who've passed away due to COVID here in our province, which is a lot. That would represent almost 10% of a year's worth of deaths in our province, by the way. Normally we have between 10 and 11,000 deaths in a year in Manitoba. There are many more people who've gotten COVID who remain ill and unwell for many months afterwards, and other people who've had heart attacks, strokes, brain injuries because they've had COVID and aren't necessarily going to die, but their lives will be permanently altered. And that really multiplies the harm. If you want to think about the full harm of this virus, it's bigger than the mortality number. So the risk of getting COVID is so high that even a not perfectly safe vaccine would be safer than getting COVID. Although the mRNA vaccines, I think, are really safe.
Even the AstraZeneca is really safe.
Yeah.
But it does, it's just this, it's this 1 in 60,000 risk of blood clots, which is, yeah. I think in terms of the AstraZeneca too, like, if we did not have mRNA vaccines, right? If they didn't exist, there would be no controversy that we'd be hearing about, right? Like the message would be, go out and get your AstraZeneca vaccine, right? Because it's an effective vaccine that's overall very safe. So the issue is that, yeah, we do have other vaccines that are even safer, So, so how do we recommend, an AstraZeneca vaccine when we've got another one that could be even safer and does not have this, this, yes, rare, but very serious adverse effect attached to it. So, so I think that we have to keep that in mind too.
I appreciate the assurance around the AstraZeneca. I received that one about 6 weeks ago and was excited for the opportunity to get it rather early, given my age. Just other circumstances in town allowed that. But then it seemed like a couple weeks later, all this negative press around it. And I thought, oh boy, did I make a mistake here?
No, I mean, I think, I agree. If you look at the message that's come out from Dr. Joss Reimer around this issue, I think it's quite good. She said, if you got the vaccine previously based on health advice, you did the right thing. And you undoubtedly, on the balance of things, made the right decision, and getting that vaccine 6 weeks early, it was a far safer thing to do, even in retrospect, than waiting, because your risk of developing COVID-19 in the interim and then having that high risk or higher risk of really bad outcomes after that was much higher. And so I mean, I think, again, if we did not have those mRNA vaccines, there wouldn't be any health authorities in the country that would not be saying, don't go out and get your AstraZeneca vaccine. No way. We'd be saying, go and get it. It's just the fact that we have, like, we're almost cursed with choice on these vaccines, right? And the mRNA vaccines have not been associated with that risk. So so at some level, you need to get that information to people too, so that they can make an informed choice, because there is a choice.
I've been trying to think about drugs that are safer than the AstraZeneca vaccine. And I'm having a hard time coming up with drugs that are safer than the AstraZeneca vaccine.
You mean the other way around, that are more risky?
No,
than the AstraZeneca.
No, penicillin is more dangerous than the AstraZeneca vaccine. More people suffer harm from penicillin than would from the AstraZeneca vaccine. That would be true from virtually any antibiotic. I have seen dozens of people die of complications from antibiotics. I don't expect, and so that's just talking about the infectious world. In terms of drugs that we use to treat heart attacks, strokes, and cancer, the percentage of people who have a very serious consequence from those drugs is not in the 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 20,000 or 1 in 50,000. We're talking about 1 in 10 or 2 in 10 or 4 in 10. the Astra-Zeneca vaccine is safer than almost any drug that I prescribe. And
Yeah. Maybe a
almost-
vitamin,
maybe a vitamin. And vitamins can be harmful.
possibly.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's helpful. Yeah. I think it's interesting, right? Because it's weighing against. I mean, I'm similar to Richard. I appreciated the assurance there, because 2 weeks ago
Yeah.
that was shot into my arm very willingly, and it was good. But yeah, there is this sense of weighing out.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's part of the. I think part of the problem is, like we we go to school for so many years to learn about the science, and then sort of the communication part about that is not necessarily something that we go to school for, And so this is a fairly, I mean, because you could give all the science, and what people are going to hear is like, oh crap, this is a bad product, I shouldn't have got it, right? But it's not. It's a good one. Super effective, super safe, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's helpful. Richard, are there other, I mean, you've in the past shared too, like you have more on the ground actual conversations maybe in regards to this. Are there other questions that come to mind for you?
Yeah. Can we talk about masks? I'm amazed at what a hot button topic
Yes.
that is. And I guess where I'm coming from is, it seemed early on in the pandemic that we were told, you know what, don't worry about masks. They're really not that effective. Stick to the fundamentals instead, right? Wash your hands, social distance. Don't worry about masks. And now we're at a point where, I mean, depending on where you are, you could potentially be fined for not wearing one in public. I get I understand the concept of trust the science. I can acknowledge that, those that are actually studying COVID will know more about, COVID in November 2020 than they did in January 2020. So yeah, I get that, trust the science, but I guess I kind of feel a little bit like a grade 8 math teacher here. And I'm going to say, can you show me your work? Don't just tell me that you know the answer, but can you
Yes.
demonstrate to me how we got that answer?
Yes, that's a good
That makes
question.
sense.
It does, yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I guess just to give it some perspective, like, going back, because I mean, I followed the same science, and I was, I mean, I remember those days in March, April, and what we saw in the beginning was that, honestly, we didn't have a great idea about a lot of things. Okay, so one of the things that was very much contested and up in the air is exactly how is this virus transmitted. Okay, and we didn't know. And so we went to other viruses that we know that we've studied extensively, and so we look at things like the flu. And then the flu, it is transmitted primarily in droplets. Okay, and those droplets can stick onto surfaces, and then we can pick them up on our hands, wipe our mouth and nose, and transmit them that way. Similarly, other cold viruses, can stay in the environment for a long time. They can live in the environment, even for many hours or even a day or longer, and we can pick them up and then transmit them to ourselves. So that was kind of the science that we were basing it off of. And there was also a lot of well, yeah, there wasn't a lot known about, what if you made a recommendation for a whole population to wear a mask, what would be the implications of that, And so there was a lot of hesitancy, at least in North America, to make such a recommendation. But other countries did not have that hesitation, especially Southeast Asia. They were very strong on recommending masks because as basically just, plain and simple, they were much more familiar with that kind of recommendation. They learned it from SARS-1, the first SARS virus. And so and that's been a part of their culture for the last 20 years. And so they made that recommendation very early. And so then what happened with over time is that we learned two things. Well, one is that SARS is not transmitted very efficiently, from surfaces, okay? And so all that stuff you saw in the beginning about, wiping down, playground equipment and the like was, not very useful. The virus, once it gets onto a surface, does not survive very long at all. And so, picking it up and then, transmitting it in that way is really not a major concern. So the other thing is that it is become more apparent that it is transmitted primarily through the air and through both droplets and even these small airborne aerosols. And so in that case, the masks become a much more effective tool for preventing those kinds of particles from getting out into the air, and it just reduces the amount. So it's kind of like what am I? The best kind of analogy here. It's kind of like if you put like a dye into a swimming pool, you can see initially the concentration of that will get less and less the farther away you go. That's kind of like how this virus acts. The farther away you are, the less concentration of the virus, and therefore, the less chance of passing it on. But what if you could actually, put put a kind of a cap on that dye container, and actually reduce the amount of dye that was actually getting into the pool in the first place? That's a much more effective tool. Okay, so kind of a similar thing. We call it source control. You put a mask on, you help, if you are spreading that virus, you're either asymptomatic and spreading it, or you have symptoms, it's going to be transmitted through the droplets and the smaller aerosol particles. You put a mask on, it just reduces that concentration by quite a bit. And so then the other thing that we saw was that, those countries that did adopt the masks, that it was a somewhat effective tool, especially in places like Southeast Asia. Now, I will say one thing, and maybe this is controversial, but I think that it is possible to oversell the value of masks. Okay, so really, the mask is not a perfect tool. Okay. The masks, we are not going to get out of this pandemic with masks. Okay, it's it is a source control tool. It is helpful, but you can think about it as like an added layer of protection. Social distancing and not sharing indoor spaces are far more effective overall. So it's an added layer. Now, how did we get to the restrictions? Well, I mean, that's another story. I don't know if you want me to speak to that part, but but yeah, essentially that's where the science went over time.
That's great, Terry. Thank you. I'd like at the Quinn, please. My daughter is
Lights
a little.
are out.
Hang on a second. I gotta turn my light on. So at the risk of treading into some slightly controversial waters, when you wear a mask, you reduce the transmission through droplets. But if you're sitting in one place and you're breathing through that mask for 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour, or if you're singing, let's say, then aerosolized particles can become more of a concern. And then the mask doesn't necessarily fully protect people who are in the area. And then also, if it's a long enough exposure, 6 feet might not protect either. And so respectfully to Dr. Rusin, I didn't agree with some of the reduced restrictions on worship that took place in spring, that they weren't safe with the advent of the variants of concern. That's a controversial statement, but I'll stand by it.
Yeah, I mean, you got to think about these things as layers, right? They're layers of protection. But let's be clear, you know, they're all stopgap measures, right? The vaccines are the way out.
Yes.
We're starting to see now, I think we had talked a little bit about this at the beginning, that more and more young people are being infected, and fewer seniors. We also know that right at the beginning of the vaccine rollout, seniors were a priority, and I think almost everyone would agree that they should have been. The fact that we're seeing this now, is that early proof that vaccines are working, particularly within the elderly population, or is there something else at play with the third wave where there seems to be such a heavy concentration on younger people being infected?
Yeah. So I mean, so yes, so that's a great question. Yeah. So the amount of virus that's going to be transmitting within a population at a given time and within subpopulations of that population is going to primarily be function of, number one, how much virus is there, and number two, how much of those people mixing. Okay. When you look at, you know, how has the vaccine impacted, you really have to look at the overall numbers. That doesn't give us a good enough look. You have to look at the different subpopulations. So when we kind of get more granular and we look at, you know, who is and isn't getting infected by this virus now, you know, the data are in that it is not infecting vaccinated populations at a, you know, it's a fraction of the rate of the unvaccinated populations. So for example, you know, personal care homes have extremely good vaccine coverage in Manitoba at this time. We are not seeing COVID-19 in personal care homes. We're not seeing it. And that's a remarkable change. You know, having been on the wards working, you know, throughout this pandemic up until, you know, February, we were seeing extraordinary numbers of personal care home individuals coming in, getting terribly sick and dying. And it was horrible. And we're not seeing it. You know, even the older individuals not in care homes now, like, you know, 80 plus, they have very good vaccine coverage rates. They're not getting sick now. So yeah, when you look at the virus, is going wild in the populations now, but it is almost all unvaccinated. There's going to be, and there is some that have had, you know, a first dose. A lot of those within that 14 days, because it takes 14 days to develop that immune response. You know, even then, there are still some that are getting infected after that. Most of them don't have severe disease, so they have 100% effectiveness, but it is very effective, especially at preventing severe disease, and that's kind of what we're seeing. That is what we're seeing.
I'm plugged into the intensive care community, and what I hear from the intensive care community is that most of my intensive care colleagues are not aware of anybody. Most of them haven't looked after anyone who became critically ill more than 14 days after their vaccine. So
Yeah.
there is a scattered number of people who in the first week to 2 weeks after they got a vaccination became very ill. But the number of people becoming ill after they have a degree of immunity, which starts around 2 weeks, forgive me if I'm getting the timing a little bit wrong, Terry. So Dr. Roustan is being accurate about that when he shares that information, that we're not seeing vaccinated people getting
Yeah.
sick in any significant number. It's a very rare event. They're
Yep.
working. They're working.
Yeah. I think that one of the sort of telling stories is like tragic, but it's such a small part of this. In like February, I think, maybe it was early March, there was a northern reservation that had rolled out the vaccine in their 65 plus. They had rolled it out they had a care home, they had rolled it out, and the community leader, elder, said that people are going out and partying. The vaccines are here. Everyone has breathed a sigh of relief. Well, guess what? The 65 and under crowd had not been vaccinated. And so what happened was they had a huge wave of COVID-19 that just absolutely devastated that community. And so I think there's a lot of different things going on here, there's potentially a lot more mixing, and also now we have the variants that are more severe and even in younger individuals. And so these kinds of things contribute to the waves. And it's not only here, it's happened, in many places across the world. Even though some places are getting it under control, there are many places across the globe that are still under a lot of pressure from this virus.
If a person has had COVID-19, what do you say to them in regards to vaccination? Do they still go get it? Are they then immune for a time, or what is that like?
Yeah. The best guidance right now, like there is some short-term immunity. The immune system is a funny thing and not always the most intuitive. So when it comes to COVID-19, the immune response that is seen to getting the infection is a pretty disorganized one. So it's almost like the body doesn't know what to target, what to respond to. You could ask, sociologic questions like, why is that? It's a very interesting question. But it's not as efficient of a response as actually we see from the vaccination targeting very specifically that spike protein. And so there is protection, and the recommendation right now is that I would give someone would be 90 days from when you had that positive test, go out and get your vaccine. You do have some short-term protection, but it's not going to give you long-term protection against the disease.
In the coming months, I'm looking forward to hopefully doing two things. I want to be able to welcome people back into my church, and I want to go see a Blue Bomber football game. Not that I'm going to hold either of you to this, but as we're talking about more and more people within the community getting vaccinated, do we have rough targets as to how many people percentage-wise we need a first dose, how many we need a second dose, before we can starting to live a life again that starts to resemble pre-COVID, at least in some way?
That's $1 million question, so when we talk about the percentage that we need to have vaccinated in order to get what we call herd immunity, which is a term. Basically, what is herd immunity? It is like it's having enough rods in the chain of a reaction, okay, to use this sort of a chemical analogy, that the viral transmission slows down. It doesn't stop, but it slows that transmission down, so that each chain of transmission, each time it's passed on, the chances are that the transmission will slow and not ramp up like we've seen, all these other waves. Okay, so even when you have herd immunity, you can still have focal outbreaks, and that can be sometimes in communities where they have lower rates of transmission, but it won't necessarily spread. It won't catch fire, so to speak. And so that's the herd immunity. Herd immunity really depends on, how transmissible is the virus. Based on the old COVID-19 wild type, not before we saw the variants of concern, people were estimating, the epidemiologists estimated that it would be about 70% of the overall population that we needed to see vaccinated before you had that herd immunity. That's just a guess, but it was an educated guess. Now that we have these variants of concern, I'm sorry to say that that is higher, and is it high? I don't know how high it is, actually, and actually no one does. Anyone that tells you they know is lying to you at this point. So it's just an unknown right now. So is it 75, 80%? Maybe. I mean, I think that we're going to have to see. I do think that there needs to be some communication about, like, what are our targets in terms of opening up. And you can look at the plan in Saskatchewan. I think that's an interesting idea and a good one, to give that sense, like, once you reach these targets in terms of percentage of the population vaccinated, whether you choose 70% or 75 or whatever of adults, to start opening phase 1, phase 2. I'd like to see that. Yeah. Yeah. So that's not really an answer. I'm really optimistic that we're going to get to 70% of the population for dose 1, from what it looks like from the projections, definitely by mid-June. It looks like we'll hit it by mid-June. And so I think that you can't use just one measure, that, and then you see those infections coming down, the hospitalizations coming down. I am hopeful, I'm optimistic that we're going to see see those restrictions loosening by July for sure, and it should be quicker than it was last time. I think it will be, because of the vaccines.
Jerry, I certainly hope that you're right, that we can loosen up sooner than last time. Right now in the hospitals, there's a really rapid progression of inpatients. We're having about 30 more patients per day in hospital. And that doesn't sound like a very big number, but we don't have that many hospital resources in our province compared to these numbers. And our ICUs are at 100% capacity for sure. And so until in the very short term, we don't have a choice until the numbers start to come down and the hospitals start to be able to function before any restrictions can come down. So not to hazard a guess, but the numbers would have to be a lot lower. The number of people in hospital would have to be in a very clear decline before things can loosen up. And for that to be by the last week of May is extremely hopeful. And I'm not that hopeful. Yeah, and I'm not happy about that. I'm sick of isolation too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that things that would be really easy for the province to do, and really I hope they do, is to loosen things up outside. I mean, as far as transmission of this virus is concerned, the risk of transmission outdoors is not zero. It's extremely low compared to transmission indoors. And so, I mean, that's one of these lessons that we've learned. It's kind of like one of these zombies that we keep seeing, like, there's recommendations about masks outdoors and things like that. It's just, I mean, go ahead and use one if you want, but it's like, focusing on that is an extremely diminishingly low rate of return. And, I think that encouraging people to do things more outdoors socially is going to help keep them from doing stuff indoors, or keep them, from at least doing these clandestine meetings indoors. And that's kind of what I'm really worried about. You drive people out of the public sphere, shame and blame them for, gathering in a park or what have you. And then what do? They go in the basement, and that's just such a higher risk of transmission, And so, you go where the money is what be my thing. And so, like, I hope that they definitely loosen up sort of out of door gatherings. It'll be a nice summer, maybe having some congregations in the park would be, a nice thing. And outdoor activities, children's sports and that sort of thing. I think that is definitely something that I hope that they would loosen up as soon as feasible, as soon as possible.
One of the things I think I heard you say earlier is that we're never going to get rid of COVID completely. It's going to be here. Do you have a sense of what we need to see? I mean, unless there's like an isolated outbreak somewhere, whether it be daily cases, test positivity rate, hospitalization numbers. At what point do you think we can say this is manageable, we have this under control, or perhaps even this is starting to look like herd immunity, particularly if it's extended, those numbers are extended over, I don't know what you would measure that in, whether it be weeks or months or longer intervals.
Yes, I don't think the virus is going away. I think it's with us. I think that it's going to become a lot more manageable with that high number of vaccinations. It's going to basically turn into another version of the flu. And yes, the COVID-19 is much more severe than the flu as it is right now. But once you've got that vaccination level in the community, then, I think that, you're going to see, some people getting sick. It's not going to be in like huge numbers because, again, we're going to have those rods in the chain of transmission that's going to prevent the spread of transmission so quickly from person to person. And number two, if some people are getting infected, perhaps some of them may have had one dose of vaccine or two, and that's going to really prevent them from getting as sick. So, both of those things we're going to see, that it's just going to become so much more manageable. It's not going to overwhelm our health system. There may be other things that overwhelm our health system, but in that case, it won't be the COVID-19.
Yeah, I agree. While COVID probably will never be gone, the pandemic will end. Is that fair to say, Terry?
Yeah. Yes.
Hopefully soon.
I'm looking forward to this summer. I mean, it's going to be, it's crazy right now in the hospitals, and that's what I'm looking at right now. But I'm looking at the other end of that in July, and I'm looking forward to the summer.
Wow. Yeah, let it be. Yeah. This is super helpful. Richard, how you doing? Do you have other questions there?
Oh, you're on mute, Richard.
I've exhausted my list, but I've also talked a lot more tonight than I was planning on. So I'll turn it over to Cam. Do you have anything that you'd like to add to this?
No, I find this really helpful. This is important for us to be able to even continue to pass on this resource to those that are receiving these questions on a daily basis and interacting with people on a daily basis that are trying to make their choice. And I find this really, really helpful. So thank you both. Yeah, other words from you though. Yeah, Tim?
I just have like a brief comment, and this is more kind of a maybe coming from my faith perspective more than anything.
Right.
The answer to the pandemic every step of the way has been altruism. Caring for others has always been the right answer during the pandemic. And right now, like in the very short term, meaning the next number of weeks, that means following the health restrictions, the public health restrictions as they are. But in the longer term, the way through this is, even if you are not afraid of becoming ill yourself, receiving the vaccine because it is safe and because you're protecting others around you. And so altruism, caring for others, will get us through.
Yeah, thank you.
That's the most important thing probably that I have to say tonight.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Terry, last word for you?
Oh man, it's been a long haul, hey? Like, holy moly. I don't know if we've ever asked this much of people over such a long period of time, and like in public health, like I don't think it's ever happened, you know? And so, I mean, I totally get it that people are just exhausted. I'm exhausted, you know? And I see it, you know, I see it in the hospitals. I see it. I'm right there in that world, and I'm exhausted by it all. It was, you know, our kids back to remote learning this week, and you know, and that is demoralizing, you know. And so, yeah, I mean, like, I think that, you know, important to keep it in perspective. Like, we have saved countless lives with what we've done. You know, it's not, it's a stall. It absolutely a stall, but the stall is to get people vaccinated, because, you know, in terms of developing that immunity, you know, you rather get the virus and have a chance, like basically Russian roulette, you know, is it going to hit you hard or is it going to hit you soft? And we don't know. And so, you know, we've stalled and it's been hard, but we're at this point and the vaccines are here. So, like, don't be that person. Don't be that person who gets COVID-19, you know, within a week or a few weeks before you get that really critical immunity from the vaccine.
Thank you.